In the somber gloom of the Stateville Correctional Center in Crest Hill, Illinois, a day marked on the calendar of justice loomed with an implacable finality. It was May 10th, 1994, and the cold concrete walls, impregnated with countless stories of desperation and contrition, witnessed the last breath of a man. On that date, a subject whose name still resonates today with an echo of horror faced lethal injection. His sentence was a legal tangle of a magnitude that defied human comprehension: 21 life sentences and 12 death sentences, an accumulation that, in purely legal terms, resulted in a mathematical absurdity, but which reflected the dreadful extent of his crimes. The execution chamber, with its sterile environment and its cold fluorescent light, was the final stage for a life woven with threads of deceit and blood. The air, dense and silent, was only interrupted by the faint hum of medical equipment. Every second stretched, heavy, inexorable. The injection, a chemical cocktail designed to extinguish life with dispassionate efficiency, marked the end of an era of terror. This man had been, finally, executed with a lethal injection. Perhaps upon hearing his story, the perception of the innocent figure of the clown will transform into something much darker, into a shadow that lurks in the darkest corners of the human psyche. The individual whose conviction we have just recounted was none other than John Wayne Gacy, Jr., born in 1942 into a family that embodied the traditional values of post-war North America. They were deeply devoted in their faith, unshakably Republican in their political affiliation, and strictly adhered to the customs and morality of the era. John was the only male child, flanked by 2 older sisters, in a home where the paternal figure cast an imposing shadow. His father was a rough man, with stern gestures and a penetrating gaze, a railroad machinist of robust build, blonde hair, and an aquiline nose that denoted authority. His treatment was abrupt, often lacking any hint of tenderness. The mother, in contrast, was the epitome of the devoted and proper housewife, a woman of impeccable manners, whose life revolved around the care of the home and family. In those formative years, Johnny, as his mother affectionately called him, was a kind and gentle child, deeply attached to her and his sisters. However, his physique, notably overweight, was a constant source of disapproval for his father, who, with his own image of strength and virility, saw in his son's delicacy and overweight a personal affront. This paternal dissatisfaction manifested itself in aggressive and verbally abusive treatment. The cutting words, the hurtful insults, the derogatory allusions to his appearance, and the constant teasing that equated him to a girl instead of a boy, created an environment of constant humiliation. Despite this emotional torture at home, John proved to be an exemplary student, with sharp intelligence and a remarkable capacity for socialization. Not only was he an outstanding student, but he also actively participated in all spheres of school life. Beyond academics, his work ethic manifested at an early age. He worked in a supermarket as a packer, or cerilito, as it is known in Mexico, and managed a morning newspaper delivery route. This early entrepreneurial spirit allowed him to have his own money and acquire his belongings, fostering an unusual independence for his age. His commitment to the community was equally notable. He was an active member of the Boy Scouts, earning medals and recognitions that attested to his dedication. The family, deeply Catholic, instilled in him active participation in the church. However, all these achievements, both academic and extracurricular, were systematically despised by his father. Every medal, every award, every sign of success was met with icy indifference, or worse still, with contempt and the persistent derogatory label of effeminate. The father, with his rigid view of masculinity, refused to recognize any virtue in his son that did not fit his narrow parameters. It was an incessant cycle of seeking approval and brutal rejection, an open wound in young John's psyche. During this period, some versions, later considered defense arguments, suggest the possibility of child sexual abuse that was never reliably proven. However, what is undeniable is that John's adolescence marked the beginning of a deep internal contradiction. The omnipresent figure of the father, rough, energetic, but emotionally distant and cruel, fostered a devastating conflict within him. On one hand, he felt pressured by social and family expectations to interact with girls, to conform to an image of heterosexuality. On the other, he experienced a total absence of attraction, a void that made every interaction an evident fiasco, a clumsy inability to connect romantically. The last year of secondary school, what is known as high school, became an ordeal. His father's teasing and insults reached an unsustainable point, pushing him to a desperate decision to gather his savings and flee home. His destination was Las Vegas, a city of lights and false promises where he found employment in a funeral home. Far from the glamorous life, this precarious job barely allowed him to subsist, and money was scarce even for the return ticket. It took him 3 long months of effort and privations to gather the necessary funds to return home. Upon his return, with renewed determination, he quickly completed high school and enrolled to study business at the prestigious Northwestern Business School. There, his innate capacity for numbers and strategy fully manifested. He was an exceptional student, graduating with excellent grades in record time, which opened the doors to a job that would reveal his true talent. In the professional field, John Wayne Gacy was an unstoppable force. A consummate salesman, a charismatic leader, an individual who moved with surprising ease and effectiveness despite his imposing physique. At 1.75 meters tall and weighing over 100 kilograms, he was a robust and corpulent man. However, his appearance was not an obstacle. In fact, his physical presence combined with his mental acuity made him an exceptional employee. He received multiple recognitions, rapidly ascending in the company hierarchy, surpassing the sales level to reach positions of greater responsibility in a meteoric rise. His professional performance was not the only facet of his active life. His volunteer spirit remained intact, prompting him to participate in every organization that crossed his path. He joined the Junior Chamber of Commerce, known as JC's, an association dedicated to leadership and commerce, where he taught courses, gave talks, and organized events and camps. Simultaneously, he continued to be a devoted leader of the Boy Scouts, maintained his affiliation with the Chiro Group, the Catholic Church, the Chicago Civil Defense League, and the Holy Spirit League. He was a man with inexhaustible energy, working 12 hours a day and still finding time for his multiple public commitments. His dedication was such that he received an invitation to work in Springfield, Illinois, in a large-scale business. He assumed the position of sales manager, and immediately his ability to lead and generate results made him stand out. It was the year 1964, and at barely 20-something years old, John Wayne Gacy was building an astonishing career, accumulating prestige and recognition, feeling proud of each of his achievements. He had a promising career, an impeccable reputation, and finally, he found love. Yes, despite his father's constant criticism, his derogatory treatment that never stopped, Gacy had achieved what many longed for. Even when he tried to share his successes, such as buying a new car, his father's indifference was brutal. Upon going home with the illusion of showing him his acquisition, his father did not even get up. dismissing him with insults and a cold hostility that marked the perennial tension of their relationship. But in Springfield, the situation was different. He met a woman who was captivated by his dynamism, his friendliness, his eloquence, and his imposing physical presence. It wasn't long before they married. She, the daughter of a wealthy Iowa family, whose empire included several stores of a well-known fried chicken chain, soon invited him to join her business. His reputation in Jaycees and his achievements in Illinois preceded him, and recommendations quickly reached Iowa. John continued his ascent, settling into a beautiful house with a young wife and a job that, in a short time, allowed him to take control of several branches of the family business. His effectiveness was undeniable, his success resounding. However, behind the facade of a perfect life, deep problems were brewing in the domestic sphere. John, despite his public charisma, was not a loving man, nor particularly passionate in his romantic relationships. In the intimacy of his home, his emotional presence was practically null. They had a son and, shortly after, a second daughter. But the distance between him and his wife became increasingly evident. To the outside world, John Wayne Gacy remained a whirlwind of activity, a rattlesnake that came and went, climbing steps ceaselessly. He worked 14 hours or more if necessary, and on his days off, he dedicated himself to his multiple organizations. It didn't matter if he had gotten up at 5 in the morning. If there was a night meeting, he would be present, always with a smile and contagious energy. But at home, the story was different. His wife noticed that when she approached him, he pulled away. When she sought a deeper connection, he fled with the excuse of some meeting or unavoidable commitment. These fissures in his personal life soon manifested themselves also in his work environment. In the fried chicken restaurant chain, in addition to having mastered the secret recipe for success, Gacy had discovered a particular interest in the numerous young employees. This chain, characterized by hiring teenagers between 16 and 18 years old to introduce them to the world of work, had become a breeding ground for disturbing rumors. Mr. John began to be known for his obscene jokes and crude comments directed at the boys. And not only that, some employees began to complain about uncomfortable advances. The murmur grew. Mr. John, it was said, concealed a homosexual preference. To the outside world, he remained John Wayne, the exemplary guy, the brilliant executive, the boss who pushed businesses to the limit, bold and innovative. But in the shadows, the veiled accusations became increasingly persistent. In 1968, the shadow ceased to be an insinuation to become a formal complaint. A grand jury received an indictment against him for having abused a 17-year-old boy, a crime known in the United States as sodomy. Gacy was accused of having sexual relations with the boy without his consent. In his defense, Gacy claimed that the relationship had been consensual, but admitted to having had physical contact with the minor. The young man, however, insisted that he had been attacked. During the trial, the accusation seemed to falter, with the possibility of being dismissed. But then, a dramatic turn. It was discovered that John Wayne Gacy had hired a thug to beat the young man and prevent him from testifying. The boy, demonstrating surprising bravery, defended himself, managed to break free, and counterattacked the aggressor. The police intervened, revealing the coercion. This fact, the attempt to obstruct justice, sealed Gacy's fate. The judge declared him guilty and sentenced him to 10 years in prison. Simultaneously, his idyllic world crumbled. His beautiful family, composed of his 2 cute little children and his pretty, very American wife, abandoned him. The divorce was immediate. He lost his job, his wife's house, the car she owned, and with it his friends, his prestige, everything. The world turned its back on him, and he found himself alone in prison. The only visits he received were from his mother and occasionally from his sisters, encounters that, despite everything, were very well received. His father, however, never showed the slightest interest in knowing about him, maintaining until the end his contempt and the hurtful assertion that his son was a homosexual. John Wayne Gacy, throughout his life, had strived to hide, deny, and repress his true sexual identity. But at the end of the day, the truth exploded, dragging him into the depths of jail and ignominy. However, John Wayne Gacy Jr. possessed a peculiar gift, an innate ability for oratory, persuasion, dynamism, and discipline. In prison, this gift flourished to its fullest extent. He transformed into the model inmate par excellence, an exemplary figure within the walls. If a volunteer was needed, he was the first to sign up, and even if not required, he found a way to offer his help. Always willing to collaborate, his cell was a model of cleanliness and order, a reflection of his meticulousness. He spent his free time drawing, an activity that completely absorbed him, and dedicated time to teaching other inmates when he was not immersed in his own tasks or in the work assigned by the prison. He was never seen involved in fights or problems. He was the embodiment of good conduct. His attitude earned him the respect and even the affection of other inmates, including mafia figures and hardened killers who appreciated his kindness, cordiality, and willingness to teach and help them in whatever was necessary. So impeccable was his behavior that, from a 10-year sentence, John was released after only 18 months. Free, once again, to start over. When his mother and sisters waited for him at the prison gates to take him home, the first question that sprang from his lips, laden with a deep wound, was, "Did my father ask about me before he died?" His father had passed away a couple of months earlier, and on his deathbed he had never uttered his name, never shown the slightest interest. The revelation devastated Gacy, rekindling the old wound of paternal rejection. Despite the shock and under strict parole supervision, John managed to get a job as a cook, applying the secret recipe of his previous success. With frenetic dedication, he worked 3 shifts in a row, a feat that allowed him to quickly accumulate a considerable amount of money. Just a few months later, with financial help from his mother and sisters, he managed to buy a small house, a new beginning for everyone. It was a very nice new home, located in an emerging and attractive neighborhood called Northwood Park. The small house had 2 bedrooms, a living room, a dining room, and a kitchen. A peculiar feature, and essential for the Illinois climate, was that the house was raised from the ground, with an air chamber underneath to combat the harsh winter and snowfalls. It was not a basement, but a strategic void between the ground and the base of the structure, designed for protection against the cold. John moved into this charming little house, and once again his natural charisma worked miracles. He quickly became friends with all his neighbors, radiating friendliness and kindness. Always attentive, he would ask if anyone needed anything, and if not, he would show up with a small gift, thus winning the hearts of everyone around him. It was his great success, the art of social manipulation brought to perfection. But once again, internal problems reappeared. He was arrested by the police for inappropriate conduct. One Friday afternoon, while driving his car through downtown Chicago, he stopped at a corner and made an indecent proposal to 2 young men. Fortunately for him, despite being on parole, the boys did not press charges, which allowed him to avoid a new conviction and continue with his life without major legal repercussions. This episode, however, reinforced his growing sense of superiority, of being the life of the party, the indispensable, the beloved. He had managed to hide his past in prison, and now people adored him. His frantic participation in the community resumed. He became an active member of JC's again and got involved with the Democratic Party, harboring political ambitions that would take him as high as he could go. He associated with various youth groups and was recognized as a sensational guy. He even found a new wife, a divorced woman with 2 daughters, with whom he formed an apparently happy home, full of visits and joy. But happiness was a fragile illusion, eaten away by a persistent and deeply disturbing detail. The house always smelled bad, a peculiar, indescribably unpleasant odor. One afternoon, during a visit from his neighbors and friends, the wife of one of them, with well-intentioned frankness, commented, "John, I think it would be wise for you to hire someone to check, because there are surely many dead rats down there. This smells very bad." Gacy, far from being annoyed, smiled and with forced calm replied, "No, we already checked. What happens is that the humidity in the basement generates mold, and that's what it smells like." Carol, his new wife, suggested the possibility of a broken pipe, but Gacy, always busy with his tireless work, postponed the inspection. "I'll fix it soon," he assured. The smell was unmistakable, and many visitors noticed it. However, once past the threshold, attention was diverted to the beautiful back lawn, where Gacy organized spectacular barbecues attended by police, firefighters, thanks to his volunteering in emergency services support groups, and party members, all friends and admirers of John. In the public sphere, his prestige was unimpeachable. But in the intimacy of the home, problems persisted. Carol noticed that her husband, suddenly, got lost in his own thoughts, pulled away from her, disappeared emotionally. Added to this was a disturbing picture in the living room, the figure of a clown. Carol detested it, but John loved it, and his house housed numerous drawings of clowns, which he considered art. Furthermore, the woman witnessed unusual outbursts of violence, erupting without apparent need or reason. One day, John left the cooking business to embark on a new entrepreneurial adventure. His own remodeling, painting, and maintenance company, PDM Painting, Designing, and Maintenance. It was not a large-scale construction company, but a firm dedicated to domestic repairs. The business prospered rapidly, making him an active member of the Chamber of Commerce. He owned an equipped pickup truck, a closed van for transporting materials, and an elegant black car for his personal travels. His pace of activity was frenetic, almost feverish, so much so that his health began to suffer. On 2 or 3 occasions he suffered heart ailments that forced him to reduce stress. He also carried the aftermath of a violent blow suffered in childhood with a swing, an incident that his defense would later use to argue for possible mental instability. However, nothing seemed to stop him. But in 1975, approximately 3 years after his second marriage, Carol reached her limit. One day, John simply disappeared from her life, emotionally absent. Although she tried to approach him, he repelled her violently. Furthermore, Carol made disturbing discoveries. She found grotesque photographs. When questioned, John admitted bluntly that he liked those things. Heartbroken, Carol decided to leave, and with her departure, Gacy felt a new wave of joy. The house was finally his. No one would criticize him for the smell, no one would interrupt his parties, no one would stop him in his true vocation, that of Pogo, the smiling clown. And that's how Pogo fully emerged. At Democratic Party events, Gacy appeared dressed as a clown, the life of the party. At charity functions, he was the clown who entertained children, always with that horrible and distinctive face paint. He performed jokes, magic tricks, and visited hospitals to give balloons to sick children. In the party, his popularity grew exponentially. Voluntarily, and without charging a single cent, he took care of the cleaning and maintenance of all offices, earning everyone's appreciation. His company, PDM, also enjoyed great recognition for its supposed community support. Gacy had the peculiar habit of exclusively hiring very young boys of delicate and fragile appearance. They were thin young men, some with long hair, and many of them blonde. This pattern was unusual in the construction or maintenance sector, where companies usually preferred strong and sturdy personnel, often of Mexican origin, for heavy work. Gacy, however, justified his choice by arguing that he sought to give them an opportunity for growth, for learning, a preparation that would take them off the streets. This initiative was well regarded by society and earned him additional recognition. While John Wayne Gacy cultivated this double life, the police in the Chicago and Springfield region began to notice a disturbing increase in disappearances. The report spoke of missing persons, mostly very young males, whose last trace was lost on lonely streets, bus stops near the highway, or in wooded areas where they used to go camping. Searches intensified, but yielded no clues. Likewise, at least a couple of complaints arose from young men who frequented homosexual preference bars in the city center, and who had also disappeared. As the mystery deepened, John Wayne Gacy, the charismatic businessman and clown, posed for a photograph alongside President Carter's wife, Rosalind Carter. He was appreciated in the party, cultivated friendships with Secret Service members who had given him a small emblem with an S, and even knew several police officers. Always willing to do favors, Gacy seemed untouchable. However, in his innermost circle, among his employees, uncomfortable rumors began to circulate. The boss likes little boys and not little girls, and sometimes he tends to play very crude jokes. One of his employees, a cunning young man, shared a chilling experience. Gacy had summoned him to his house under the pretext of work. There, amidst obscene and silly jokes, Gacy tried to put handcuffs on him, claiming they were for a magic trick. But the young man, quicker, managed to handcuff Gacy with his own handcuffs, leaving him on the floor, while he himself laughed at the situation. He had no idea what he had saved himself from. Inexplicably, the young man continued working for Gacy for the next year, as if nothing had happened, until the day he, without warning, disappeared. Other young employees also confessed to having experienced uncomfortable situations with the boss. But the pay was good and the work was not bad, and they even considered it fun. Many young people accepted these conditions for their own ambitions, like one who dreamed of car racing and dedicated his savings to improving his vehicle, an old and beautiful Plymouth Satellite. When this young man disappeared, his car was found abandoned. No trace of him. Another young man, also working to finance his car repairs, also disappeared one day. 3 or 4 days later, the police stopped a driver in a Plymouth Satellite who had tried to escape from a gas station without paying. When questioned, the young man declared, "I don't know. The car is not mine. Ask my boss, it's his." The police, following the lead, showed up at John Wayne Gacy's house. "What happened? Why do you have that car? Is that car a missing persons?" they asked. Gacy, with his usual composure, replied, "No, of course not. So-and-so, the owner of the car, sold it to me. I don't know what he might have done. I don't know where he is. He sold it to me, and then he didn't come to work anymore." The police surprisingly believed him. They gave him the car, and Gacy paid the debt at the gas station. The matter was settled. The boy, of course, never reappeared. From then on, disappearances became more frequent and strange. Some of the boys from work simply didn't come back anymore. When asked, Gacy claimed not to know anything. Then a disappearance occurred that would finally mobilize the authorities. Robert Piest, a 15-year-old boy who worked in a pharmacy, disappeared one afternoon. His mother, who used to pick him up after his shift, arrived and did not find him. Robert had told her that a remodeling contractor would see him to offer him a much better-paying job, which had him very excited. After a period of anxious waiting, the mother despaired. The boy was nowhere to be found. His belongings were still in the pharmacy, indicating that he had not left voluntarily. The pharmacy manager informed her that Robert had left, saying, "I'll be right back," as if someone had come to pick him up. The mother went to the police. During the interrogation, when reporting the disappearance, she remembered the contractor's name. A certain John Wayne Gacy from such and such a company. The police decided to investigate. Visiting Gacy at his house, they asked him about the incident, to which he replied, with his usual coldness, that he knew nothing. The next day they summoned him to the police station, where Gacy reiterated his ignorance, stating that yes, he had had an appointment with a boy for a job, but that he never arrived. The chief in charge of the case, Lieutenant Joseph Joe Kosensack, a man of great intuition and experience, decided to go further. Gacy seemed extremely strange to him. At that time, John Wayne weighed between 120 and 130 kilograms, with his 1.75 meters in height. He was an imposing mass with a thick, muscular neck that denoted considerable strength. Kosensack ordered an exhaustive search of police records. The finding was disturbing. John Wayne Gacy had a record as a sexual offender, specifically against young males. Although the last accusation had been withdrawn due to lack of witnesses, the previous ones were very clear. Armed with this information, the lieutenant obtained a search warrant. The authorities arrived at Gacy's house in his absence. Upon entering, they began to trace every corner. They found personal objects that, in themselves, did not constitute a crime. Erotic films, some suggestive images, strange personal objects, and a small bag with marijuana and Valium. However, there was nothing that could immediately justify a serious accusation. Nevertheless, these findings did serve to obtain a temporary detention, an arrest warrant that allowed them to keep him in custody for thorough questioning and to deepen the investigation. Among the most striking objects found in that first review, a police ID, a ring with initials that were not his, a man's ring, and several items of men's clothing whose size was tiny, too small for Gacy, stood out. During a second, more meticulous search, the peculiar smell of the basement, that ugly smell that so bothered visitors and his ex-wife, caught Detective Kosensack's attention. The same stale stench that others had dismissed as dampness or dead rats alerted his keen sense. He decided to take a look at the air chamber under the house, that void that protected it from winter. In a preliminary inspection, they noticed that at the bottom, beneath the structure, lime was scattered, that white powder used in construction. At first glance, they discovered nothing unusual, except for the penetrating, stale, and ugly smell. However, the inspection of Gacy's car and truck yielded much more alarming findings. They found a carpet with a blood stain that did not match John Wayne Gacy Jr.'s blood type. Furthermore, in the trunk of the car, they found hair. This hair not only did not match Gacy's, but chillingly matched the color and type of hair of Robert Piest. Something is not right, Kosensack told himself. and immediately they returned to the house to continue the investigation. Now, with renewed urgency, they descended into the void under the house and, given the persistence of the stench, called the coroner. As soon as the specialist put his nose into that confined space, the first thing he declared was, "There are bodies. The smell is of death. There are corpses here." Immediately, the excavation began. At that initial point, only small remains were found. Gacy, seeing himself cornered by irrefutable evidence, admitted to having killed one person, claiming self-defense. To try to get off, he even took the police and showed them the exact spot where he had buried the body. They recovered the corpse of an unknown person, and Gacy reiterated his self-defense story. However, the detectives were not convinced. The coroner had been categorical. The stench came from decomposing flesh. The search continued with a somber intensity. The days grew long, eternal, as the nightmare unfolded. Corpses began to emerge everywhere, in a macabre display. The house, so small in appearance, hid a clandestine cemetery beneath its structure. As soon as they moved a little earth, a body appeared. The coroner, with professional determination in the face of the atrocity, decided to delimit the entire area, establishing a meticulous grid to locate each remains, to avoid confusion and reconstruct what had happened. But the evidence was overwhelming. Upon unearthing, a human skull appeared with something choked in its mouth, and next to it, another. Some bodies were piled up together in the same hole, testimony to a sadistic haste to hide the evidence. The days passed, relentless, until winter arrived, freezing the ground and making excavation work even more difficult. Simultaneously, the interrogations of John Wayne Gacy, Jr. advanced. The man, increasingly cornered, admitted to having murdered several people, but in a desperate attempt to evade responsibility, claimed that he was not the killer. He argued that there was a subject who ordered him to kill, an alter ego he called Jack Hanley, who was the true perpetrator. He, Gacy, was simply a good person, trapped in the duality of his personalities, one of which was this terrible killer, Jack Hanley, whom he identified as Pogo the Clown. He insisted that everything was sudden impulses that he could not control. His defense, clinging to this narrative, managed to have several specialists study and analyze him to build an argument of incompetence to stand trial due to insanity. That is, that Gacy was a man so disturbed that he could not be held responsible for his crimes. However, the prosecutor, with unwavering conviction, argued the opposite. Gacy planned everything carefully, which implied full awareness of what he was doing. Second, he was careful to meticulously hide the bodies, which categorized him as an organized killer. He did not usually collect trophies. The personal objects found were casual, not kept ex professo. The small-sized men's clothing was not part of a fetish, but had been left there accidentally. Furthermore, Gacy used to take his victims to his house. They were not random or impulsive attacks on the street, although he also did that, but rather he planned them. When the evidence became undeniable, with more than 20 bodies under his house, Gacy ended up admitting that he had murdered about 30 people. 4 of them he threw into the river because he no longer had space under the house, he admitted, with chilling coldness. The investigations continued, revealing even more bodies. Throughout this time, the coroner determined that the victims had been killed in various ways: beaten, strangled, or suffocated with the clothes he had put in their mouths. In his eagerness to silence them, to prevent screams that could alert, he inserted Clothes, paper, socks down their throats, causing them to suffocate. The bodies showed evident signs of torture, injuries, burns, blows, strangulation, and, in some cases, evidence of another nature as well. Gacy himself, without batting an eyelid, would admit to having perpetrated sexual abuses on the bodies. As the macabre truth emerged, a survivor appeared, a figure who broke the silence of the victims. This individual, after being tortured and abused in the most varied ways, had been abandoned at a point in Chicago. Gacy had gotten tired of beating him because the man simply wouldn't die. So he threw him there, believing he would perish. But he survived. And he was able to recognize his aggressor, becoming the key witness who would testify to the horrors experienced in Gacy's house. His testimony revealed the monster's modus operandi, his sadistic inclinations, and the way he acted. Whoever fell into his hands was lost, and most terribly, would be aware that they would be lost. Those people did not die quickly. Gacy had enjoyed every moment in a kind of terrible torment. John Wayne. Gacy's accounts were disturbing enough to unsettle anyone, and he recounted them with the absolute indifference, as if reading a recipe. The investigation advanced relentlessly. The police identified at least 4 other cases of victims whose death was linked to the same method of killing, placing clothes inside their throats until they suffocated, a modus operandi that Gacy had not fully recognized. The killer seemed not to remember all the cases, but the police persisted. After the total demolition of the house to search for more remains, the investigations ceased. But 2 years later, during the remodeling of his mother's former house, 4 more bodies were found under a concrete slab. Gacy had worked there to expand his mother's garage, and in that place he had buried 4 additional victims. The human remains found were of the most varied. In Gacy's house, 29 bodies were found. The victims' ages ranged from 14 to their early 20s. Subsequently, 4 more bodies were found in the river, and 4 in his mother's house. In addition, 3 more victims were identified who, although Gacy did not recognize and were not found in the previous locations, were attributed to him. The saddest thing, however, is that numerous corpses were never claimed by anyone. There was no missing person report, no identification, no way to know who they were. 9 of the bodies were never identified. It is believed that they were people engaged in male prostitution in the alleys of Chicago who were abducted and murdered. No one claimed them, no one reported their disappearance, and no relatives were ever found. Although in some cases, such as a body with a tattoo, this served for it to be recognized by relatives. In the 9 unidentified cases, the victims were between 14 and 27 years old. The oldest, a 27-year-old male, wore denim shorts, sports shoes, and a wedding ring. No one claimed him, suggesting he may have been a victim of prostitution or a marginal life. In one particular case, Gacy abducted and murdered 2 boys at once. John Wayne Gacy's modus operandi would be revealed in all its depravity. It was simple and methodical. At his employees, he would call them home under the pretext of doing some work. Once there, he would start a little game. He would pretend to teach them a magic trick with handcuffs, then subdue them. If they didn't comply, he would show them a trick with a rope, immobilizing them. When these stratagems failed, he would overpower them by force, placing a chloroform-soaked cloth over them until they were unconscious, then tying them up. But Gacy did not only act with his employees. He used to wander the streets on Saturdays, approaching solitary boys on street corners. He would offer them marijuana, some drug, a good time, going to a bar, going with some girls, giving them money. Many, tempted by the promise of easy money and pleasure, agreed to accompany this corpulent man of over 100 kilos, without knowing they were heading to their death. Gacy, though not very tall, was very strong, with considerable strength. After committing his horrible crimes, he would dress as a clown and attend children's parties, where he had earned a reputation. After the discovery of his atrocities, the Democratic Party apologized, assuring that they were unaware of the man's background. The famous photograph of Gacy alongside the First Lady, Jimmy Carter's wife, was banned in some media, but, of course, it was already circulating everywhere. Over the following years, numerous specialists tried to understand Gacy's mind. Was he really a lunatic, incapable of being judged, or a calculating criminal? The opinions of psychiatrists, psychologists, and analysts did not fully coincide, but a conclusion was finally reached. This man did everything with premeditation. It was obvious. He had founded a company to hire only potential victims. He had worked in places that provided him with potential victims. He surrounded himself with young people, attended events dressed as a clown, perhaps with the idea that this would facilitate approaching other people, would give him sympathy and prestige. John Wayne Gacy was a megalomaniac killer, a type of megalomaniac killer who considered himself superior to everyone. His way of operating revealed a deep contempt for the police's ability. He believed that they would never find him, despite the disappearances being clearly related to him. His crimes were those of an organized killer. After a long trial, the court declared him competent to be judged, and his crimes deserved the death penalty. 12 times, although one cannot die 12 times, he was repeatedly condemned. He requested postponements, the commutation of the sentence, but all his petitions were denied. Finally, he was executed, as recounted at the beginning, on May 10, 1994, at the age of 52. His body was cremated and his ashes given to one of his sisters, who was in charge of disposing of them. There is no known grave for John Wayne Gacy. During his stay in maximum security prison on death row, Gacy dedicated his time to painting. Clowns, macabre clowns, whose smiles hid an abyss of depravity. He shared moments with very strange personalities. He received visits from figures from the Gothic art world and from numerous investigators, psychiatrists, mental health specialists, violence experts, and analysts who sought to decipher his mind. He also received occasional visits from a sister. He had contact with many people, wrote an autobiography, and participated in several investigations, including that of Robert Ressler, the famous FBI investigator with whom he maintained a strange relationship as Ressler tried to understand his psyche. It is crucial to note that John Wayne Gacy never admitted guilt, never recognized his full responsibility. In parallel, other killers like Jeffrey Dahmer admitted and boasted about their crimes, categorized as disorganized killers. But Gacy maintained at all times that he had been a victim of circumstances, of outbursts he could not control. He did not regret it, because he was not conscious of those acts at that moment, a statement that was far from true. This denial, however, served to illustrate the difference between an organized and a disorganized killer, and was fundamental for the development of search protocols and killer profiling. One day, his time ran out, and he was executed. Before his death, in a last attempt to convince, he declared, "The state gains nothing from my death. Society gains nothing from my death. This is murder. They are murdering me." Incredible, but true. He tried to keep selling his innocence, his right to live, until the last moment. He was a good salesman until the end. The defense arguments, child abuse, and the blow to the head do not justify the magnitude of his crimes. After his execution, Gacy's brain was extracted and sent for various analyses, which determined the total absence of lesions. It was a perfectly normal brain, ruling out the idea that brain damage could have led to his inclination to crime. Thousands of people suffer contempt and mistreatment from their parents, and yet they do not become murderers. At least 40 people, many of them young people with a promising future, ended up buried in the mud, turned into putrid flesh, because this man did not accept his own reality as a person of homosexual preference. He did not accept being who he was. He denied and hid it, transforming himself into a serial killer. Many young people with aspirations and struggles to get ahead, with dreams of building something for themselves, became simple putrid flesh in the basement of this house because this madman decided so. And while committing these horrors, he continued with a beautiful smile drawn on that grotesque face that is now presented before you, entertaining children disguised as Pogo the smiling clown.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like, subscribe to the channel, leave your comment, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any future episodes. Your support helps us keep creating more content like this. See you in the next episode.